Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome back to the second half of our lecture that was entitled First Class Laborers, Second Class Citizens. And when we left off last time, we were talking about this era of Reconstruction. And while most of the focus was on the kind of southeast of the United States, and most of the laws and things being passed had to deal with the formerly enslaved African Americans, it would have a dramatic impact on the Mexicano population, especially when Southerners begin crying a labor shortage. But we're going to pick up now in the second half of this lecture talking about the rampant discrimination that existed in, or that developed in the Southwest during the Reconstruction era. And then this should not be a surprise. There was rampant discrimination and racism and white supremacy going on pre-Civil War. Obviously with the enslavement of African Americans and things we talked about last time, post-Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, post-Mexican-American War. But the thing was, some of that racism was tempered a bit because the focus was so much on the East, so much on the Southeast in regards to slavery. But now that the issue of actual enslavement is over in the post-Civil War era, during the Reconstruction era, this becomes a prime time that Southern white racists are able to now say, how do we reaffirm or reestablish our position as superior? So let's pick up right here. Another major fallout from the end of Reconstruction and the federal government turning enforcement back over to the states was to enforce equality was the creation of the Jim Crow laws. So remember, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment took the authority to provide equality and citizenship and voting away from the states. And it put it into the hands in the jurisdiction of the federal government. But after 1877, when Reconstruction fails, when it ends, when the troops are removed, basically what happens is, while theoretically the federal government still has the jurisdiction, what the federal government does during this era is turn a blind eye. They abandon that jurisdictional responsibility. And they turn over enforcement of equality and citizenship and voting and all these things associated with quote unquote equality, being American, associated with proper whiteness, and turn it back over to the states and say, okay, we're backing off. Here's the federal government. It is your job to make sure it takes place. And without that federal oversight, the South quickly begins to re-entrench a white supremacist worldview. And they begin to do it through a series of laws and policies that we collectively call the Jim Crow laws, or the Jim Crow South, the New South. And so as African Americans begin to physically move closer to Anglos, following the end of slavery, especially following the end of Reconstruction, white supremacy will be maintained in large part by segregating African Americans as an inferior caste. Southern state governments begin to pass a series of laws that will limit the rights of African Americans that we collectively call Jim Crow laws. These laws built on the extensive system of segregation that existed throughout the South that will limit nearly every aspect of African American lives, including the right to vote, through literacy tests, through poll taxes, in other words, paying a fee to vote. And as a result, Jim Crow laws will physically separate, socially separate blacks and whites everywhere in all public spaces, denying African Americans equal access to public accommodations, transportation, and equal education, etc. And this was challenged, right? The 14th Amendment said that we have equal protection under the law. Equal protection clause, I mentioned that last time. And it was challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. You see the 14th Amendment, that part on the screen called the Equal Protection Clause, that says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property without due process, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the law. And yet in 1896, the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled in a 7-1 decision. This wasn't even close. That said, as long as the facilities like schools or water fountains or bathrooms are equal, they can be separate and still honor the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Now, of course, we all know this became law of the land, known as separate but equal. So African Americans could have a separate school as long as it was equal. But we know from history now that it was always separate, never equal. Or a great book, children's book, but a great book, Separate is Never Equal. Now that's a story you should know, right? This is taught in high schools. This is taught in, basic level history courses. This is the story everyone seems to understand. They understand what Jim Crow was. This will exist through the 1960s in many respects. But in the Southwest, there's another phenomenon that developed. Because remember, Jim Crow was mostly Southeast, including Texas. But in the Southwest, including Texas, in these heavily Spanish-speaking areas, these Jim Crow laws also became Juan Crow laws. In places like California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, separate but equal, the Jim Crow era laws made it open season not only on segregating against blacks, but also Mexicanos. In fact, it was common in places like Texas and California to have 3 separate schools. One for whites, one for blacks, one for Mexicans. It was common to prevent Mexicanos from serving on juries, from eating at white-only restaurants. And you see it. This is from Dallas, Texas, the sign on your screen. No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. Now, I've often wondered if this was done on purpose because of the size of the words, the length of the words. Dogs was the smallest number of letters. But I always imagine this is also the order of preference in many respects for whites, for Anglos in Texas. They would prefer dogs in the restaurant over African Americans or Mexicans. In fact, some would even prefer African Americans over Mexican Americans. Because at least in their minds, yes, they were black, but they were controlled. They were seen as inferior. And whereas Mexicans were trying to claim that they were also white. And Mexicans were seen as foreigners. And so what this does here with the Jim Crow and Juan Crow laws, it solidifies this white supremacy worldview, seemingly confirming, at least in their minds, that whites were superior. And while this made some easy sense in their minds in regards to the formerly enslaved African Americans, Mexicanos were more problematic because they were technically white, but their status as a defeated foe, they're being viewed as merely poor peon laborers. Their stereotyped view as being migrant and or foreign labor. Whites used all of this to cast Mexicanos as non-white, at least socially, culturally, and economically, and thus worthy of exclusion. Now again, I don't want to say that Mexicanos were totally unique in this. This was not necessarily unusual in this era, even compared to other immigrant ethnic groups. For example, the Irish were coming in by the thousands during this era. The Irish were equally hated. They were castrated out of society. They were given the hardest, most dangerous jobs. They were seen as brawlers, Catholics, drunks, violent people. But despite their hatred and animosity toward the Irish, over time, the Irish were able to assimilate. They were able to become accepted as white and equal. Whereas African Americans, and even though Mexicanos were legally white, like the Irish, whereas the Irish were able to achieve acceptance and assimilation over time, Mexicanos were never able to do that. What sets Mexicanos that is different is not necessarily their so-called foreign Spanish language. Remember, the French were allowed for speaking French. And therefore, seemingly, it falls strictly on the darker skin. Also, their status as a conquered people. Again, this is much like Native Americans, darker skin, defeated foe. And the fact they are racialized as a cheap, migrant, disposable labor force. Because of the circular migration patterns of coming from Mexico every year, this worked against them. They were seen as foreigners, outsiders. Combine that with their defeated status in war and the darker skin, and they were never assimilable to white culture. The result of all of this was a segregation of these ethno-racial groups, building on the preposition that whites had already taken their land that was supposedly due to Mexican Americans and Mexicans as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This was now buttressed by the Supreme Court. Juan Crow was just as harsh as Jim Crow, and it spread throughout the U.S. Southwest. Let me give you some examples. Take Houston, Texas. Mexican and Mexican Americans lived in the periphery. They only came into town in Houston for work. Despite the fact that Mexicans were present in Houston since 1836, again, prior to even Texas independence. And yet, in Houston, there was never a truly Mexican district or enclave. In fact, Mexican POWs after the Battle of San Jacinto, the battle that gives Texas independence, the Mexican POWs captured from that battle were forced to clear the land that eventually became the city of Houston. Think about that status. Think about that stigma. You have these Mexicans who were captured in war. Mexico surrendered that war. You force these POWs, prisoners of war, to clear the land that becomes the city. Do you really think you're ever going to allow them in the city as part of it? Of course not. In addition, we talked about the Jim Crow laws with the restrictions to voting, right? But the poll taxes and literacy tests. Well, very simple. Here in Texas, after the Civil War, Anglos made it more difficult for Mexicans and Mexican Americans, or Mexican Americans in this case, to vote. Mexicans did not vote, obviously, but Mexican Americans to vote by not printing the ballots in both English and Spanish. But yet, there's no official language in the United States. But Mexican Americans were prohibited from voting because they didn't necessarily understand or full understanding of English. Mexicanos were not allowed to serve on juries. They were not allowed into white-only spaces like restaurants. They were forced into separate schools. Again, 3-school system, white, black, and Mexican. Let me give you one example. This was just actually in the news in November of 2021. It's in Marfa, Texas. You see it on the map there. It's very southwest Texas, just across the border. And you see kind of an artist's rendition of the schoolhouse. It was a 3-room schoolhouse built in 1909. It was designated the Mexican school, even though those who went there didn't even know that when they were assigned there that they were being segregated in the school. It wasn't until years later they figured out, oh, this was a segregated school. But former students who were interviewed for this article recalled that they remembered very early on in the school year, the school and the teacher would hold a mock funeral for the Spanish language. What the teacher had the students do was they had to write on a piece of paper that said, "I will never speak Spanish again." They wrote on the piece of paper, they put their name on it, said, "I will never speak Spanish again." They took that piece of paper, they put it in a little mock box designated a coffin. And then they went out back and they buried it in the earth, covering it up with dirt in a mock funeral procession. And then the teacher said, from then on, anyone speaking Spanish would get punished. And sure enough, that same day of this mock funeral, a student got paddled, corporal punishment, for speaking Spanish. This school that was opened in 1909 as a separate Mexican school would exist until 1965. Again, we have this separate but very unequal. Punishing students for speaking their native language. Understanding these students, when they go home, they're speaking Spanish with their families. That's their first language. And yet now they go to school and they're being told, if you utter a phrase in Spanish, you will be beaten. Juan Crow at his finest. Or take the Cart War, 1857. Again, this is an example of violence. And again, like the violence against African Americans post-Civil War with the KKK, Mexicanos were viewed as an inferior, lesser, and in the case of Mexicanos, outsiders and foreigners. Now, the Cart War is on this idea of what were known as Mexican carters. Now, a carter, as you see in the picture, is someone who transport goods. Modern day, it would be the Teamsters, people who are paid to transport goods. And of course, back then, there were very few roads. It was often done by donkey or horses in a carriage. And so in 1857, near Seguin, Texas, there was a prolonged 2-year wave of violence against Mexican carters. Now, it started in 1855 near Seguin, but it would ramp up by July of 1857 with increased violence. And the thing is, what would happen is Anglo carters who were competing for jobs against the Mexican carters, they were upset that the Mexicans were stealing their jobs. And so as they began to increase the violence against the Mexicans, the local authorities did nothing. They turned a blind eye. And so violence just increased. So in 1857, Texan Teamsters, carters, who've been hauling freight from the port at Indianola to San Antonio, became increasingly bitter against the Mexican cartmen. So again, you have these Anglo-Texan Teamsters, these cartmen, who get upset over the Mexican cartmen. And they're upset because they were stealing jobs. But what was the reality was they were upset because the Mexican Teamsters were charging less money. They were charging lower rates, and thus driving the Texans out of business. But rather than lower their rates and compete, or provide better service or faster service to justify the higher rate, they instead began attacking Mexican cartmen who passed through Goliad and steal the stuff loaded in their wagons. They would destroy the carts. They would steal the freight. And then they would haul the Mexican carters up for a mock trial and hang them under the oak tree you see pictured here. Over the summer of 1857, more than 70 Mexican ox cart drivers were hanged over the course of 5 separate attacks in the summer of 1857. Think about that. Just because of business competition. And what did the authorities at Goliad do? Nothing. They were completely indifferent. And of course, why were the attacks even taking place? This was not a war at all, other than economic. They were upset because the Tejano freighters, Mexican-American Mexicanos, underbid their Anglo counterparts. That's a simple reason. And this is, again, one prominent instance. Another instance of this was what's called the El Paso Salt Wars of 1877. And there's a wrong date on my screen right now, is 1877. So in October of 1877, we will have what's called the El Paso Salt War. Now, it began in the 1860s, post-Civil War, and it is a struggle between the El Paso Anglo businessmen and their attempt to acquire the title to these lands that hold large salt deposits near the base of the Guadalupe Mountains. Now, Mexican Americans of the valley communities had for years collected the salt for free because this was known as communal land, part of the old land grants from the Mexican government. But by the late 1860s, they were now faced with the threat of being charged to collect salt that they had for generations done for free. It all comes to a head in September of 1877, when a Missouri lawyer by the name of Charles Howard becomes a district attorney in the El Paso region. And he files his own lawsuit for he himself to take control and own the Salt Lakes. So in September 1877, Charles Howard starts a riot when he arrests 2 Mexicano residents who attempted to go harvest salt. So, situation. Charles Howard wants this land because it's lucrative. He's an Anglo-Missouri lawyer who's now in Texas as a district attorney. He wants this land for himself because it's lucrative for business venture. In September 1877, 2 Mexicanos are going to drive their carts into the Salt Lake region, and they are going to attempt to harvest salt. Howard arrests them. Now, in response to this, Mexicanos form an angry mob and capture Charles Howard and hold him hostage for 3 days. Now, after 3 days, they let him go because Charles Howard promises that he will leave, that he will give up the claim to the Salt Lake beds. He will leave the county. In fact, he did. He retreated to New Mexico. But a month later, he returns and murders a man in an El Paso store. Once again, angry Mexicanos demand his arrest. And to the credit of the local law enforcement, Charles Howard would be arraigned for murder, placed under bond to appear in court in March. This is all in September, right, of 1877. So, situation now, he's killed a Mexicano man in El Paso. He's under investigation now for murder. He's going to be put on trial for murder. But he's he's out on bond, on bail bond, until March. So in December of 1877, once again, a wagon train of Mexicanos from both sides of the border, so both Mexican Americans, are going to go into the valley headed for the Salt Lakes once again. Charles Howard leaves his home, which is illegal, under bond, or under trial for murder. He leaves his home to go to the Salt Lakes once again and files a lawsuit once again. He then rounds up a handful of Texas Rangers and starts to try to get them to help him go stop these Mexicanos from harvesting the salt. The Rangers, handful of Rangers, and Charles Howard will be surrounded by, once again, an angry mob. This angry Mexicano mob is going to surround the Texas Ranger fort near El Paso. For 4 days, this mob surrounds the fort, holding these handful of Texas Rangers and Charles Howard inside. On the 5th day, Howard gives himself up to the mob. The Rangers also surrender, believing that Howard will be freed. However, on December 17th, Charles Howard was shot by a firing squad composed largely of Mexican nationals. The Rangers will only be allowed to leave the fort after they give up their guns. Now again, was this a somewhat injustice here of Charles Howard getting shot by firing squad? In the sense that it was extrajudicial, outside the court of law, he was already going to be on trial for murder. Okay, yes. He was violating his terms of bond also, though, so he should have been back in jail. But they kill him. Within a few days, though, several detachments of troops, of Texas Rangers, militia, and even a posse of Anglo citizens arrive in the San Elizario region, just outside El Paso in the Salt Lake region. They begin killing and wounding an untold number of Mexicanos. And the thing was, most of the original mob that had surrounded the Ranger fort had already dispersed. So they weren't even necessarily attacking the people who were responsible for the death of Charles Howard. They were just attacking random people who had darker skin, who spoke Spanish. And of course, no one was ever arrested. No one was ever brought to trial. And essentially, the Rangers and this white mob got away with murder. The unfortunate consequence of the Salt War was that Mexicanos from both sides of the border were robbed, assaulted, and murdered. The result was an exodus of Mexicano families from the area immediately following this event. And yes, the salt flats were claimed by Anglo businessmen. And from then on out, Mexicano communities would be forced to pay for the salt they once collected for free. For the Hispanic people of the El Paso Valley region, the Salt War was a struggle against Anglo attempts to exploit natural resources, believed by the Mexicano community as communal land. The transformation of the salt beds from communal to private ownership threatened the very survival of this border population. And once again, it painted Mexicans at the fringes of society. All of this violence, combining with the lack of enforcement of laws by Anglos or the turning of heads when Anglos commit crimes, led to even more increased violence against Mexicanos. Throughout the post-Civil War era, U.S. history teaches about the increased lynchings of African Americans to keep them in their place, so-called, during the Jim Crow era. But what is often left out is how common this was for Mexicanos as well. Remember, lynchings are an extrajudicial punishment, meaning outside the law. We saw a bit of this in the last lecture in regards to the San Francisco Vigilance Committee. But this was not confined to just San Francisco. This was widespread throughout the Southwest. Again, look on your screen. There's a few examples of pictures from this era. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Arizona in 1872, Francisco Gandara, he was suspected of being involved in the disappearance of a white man. So no charges, no investigation. There was just some suspicion that after an Anglo man went missing, he might have been involved. Vigilantes burst into his home. They murdered him in front of his wife and daughters. Or take Juanita, who in 1851 had successfully defended herself from harassment and potential rape by an Anglo miner. So she's about to get raped. She's being sexually assaulted and harassed. She defends herself successfully, escapes, only to be lynched for rejecting and murdering the man who tried to rape her. So she kills the man, this miner who tries to rape her, and she gets lynched for it. In other words, what can we conclude here? The Mexicano role in society was clear. Mexicanos were valued by whites, highly valued, as first-class laborers, needed for the growth of the United States into an empire. But as citizens, Mexicanos were second class at best, outsiders at worst. But from this position of inferiority, from this position of being cast as inferior outsiders, second-class citizens, Mexicanos would push back. And that was the topic of our next lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.